Hello and welcome. I'm Adrienne Brodeur, the Executive Director of Aspen Words, and this is my colleague Carolyn Torrey. It is our distinct pleasure to welcome you to the fourth event in this year's virtual Winter Word Series and to introduce tonight's wonderful speakers. But before I do, I'd like to look ahead to our remaining events. On March 16th, we will host a discussion around food writing featuring Padma Lakshmi, author of Love, Loss, and What We Ate, Tony Tipton Martin, author of Jubilee, and Ronnie Lundy, author of Victuals. This conversation will be moderated by Bon Appetit's Dawn Davis and will examine American cultural heritage as told through the lens of cuisine. Then on April 13th, during National Poetry Month, we'll conclude the series with former poet laureate Billy Collins in conversation with Poetry Unbound's Padraig Otwama. We hope you will be able to join us for the remaining events. Before I introduce our speakers, Carolyn will go over some housekeeping items and thank the many people and partners who make Winter Words possible.
Thanks, Adrienne, and hello, everyone. Most of you are now pretty comfortable with our virtual format, but for those joining for the first time tonight, here are a few brief reminders. We'll use the chat feature to post links throughout the event. If you'd like to purchase books by tonight's speakers or any of the other Winter Words authors, visit our partner indie bookstore, explorebooksellers.com. We've set aside the last few minutes of tonight's hour-long talk for audience questions, and you can submit those anytime using the Q&A feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And now I want to recognize and thank the partners who have helped make this virtual series possible. Our season presenting sponsors are Beth and Josh Mondry and Helen and Wally Obermeyer. Thank you to our media partner, the Aspen Times, and our grantors at the City of Aspen and Les Dames d'Aspen. And new this year, a very special thanks to our lead corporate sponsor, Book of the Month Club. Thank you to the Aspen Words Advisory Board, to everyone who purchased tickets or passes, and all of our members who support Aspen Words so generously. Speaking of membership, we're excited to offer 2 book clubs for season pass holders and members this year. We'll host the second one later this month to discuss Hidden Valley Road, and will feature one of the family members chronicled in the book. Visit aspenwords.org for membership information and keep an eye on your inbox for book club details and registration coming soon. Back to you, Adrienne.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight's speakers, both of whom are masterful storytellers in the narrative nonfiction genre, and whose interests and curiosities have led them to explore captivating topics. Robert Kolker is the author of Hidden Valley Road, the gripping tale of the Galvin family with 12 children, 6 of whom have schizophrenia. The book has been described as a scientific detective story that reads like a novel, but it is also a humanizing story that illuminates the ways families navigate and survive mental illness. Hidden Valley Road became an instant #1 New York Times bestseller and an Oprah's Book Club pick. It was named one of the top 10 books of 2020 by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Slate, one of the year's best books by NPR, the Boston Globe, and Amazon, and one of President Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020. And in late-breaking news, just today, the book was named a nonfiction finalist for the PEN American Literary Awards. Robert Kolker's previous work includes Lost Girls, also a New York Times bestseller and New York Times notable book, and one of Slate's best nonfiction books of the quarter century. Robert will be joined in conversation by Rebecca Skloot, author of another #1 New York Times bestseller, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which was made into an Emmy-nominated HBO film starring Oprah Winfrey, Renee Elise Goldsberry, and Rose Byrne. Her award-winning science writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, and many other publications. She specializes in narrative science writing and has explored a wide range of topics, including goldfish surgery, tissue ownership rights, race and medicine, food food politics, and packs of wild dogs in Manhattan. She has worked as a correspondent for WNYC's Radiolab and PBS's Nova Science Now. It is so wonderful to have both of you with us this evening. Welcome, Robert Kolker and Rebecca Skloot.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining this conversation. I'm just thrilled to be able to talk to you.
Yeah, me too. It's funny. I felt like as I was reading your book, I was just sort of, I mean, I have 7 million notes that I probably maybe won't even look at because I was just like, there's just so many things in here that made my brain click and also felt familiar. Obviously, like I think in some ways we've both gone down some pretty similar paths with reporting. So I'm just really excited to have the whole conversation. And I'm going to start with the question that, a lot of people like to ask writers, where do you come up with your ideas? How do you find your stories for your book? And in your case, I know is that you get all of your stories from a man named John Gluck. And I also happen to know John Gluck. He's just a brilliant, wonderful editor and an amazing human who was at New York Magazine. But I just, I noticed in your acknowledgments, you mentioned that he was there. I've heard you talk about that in some interviews, that he knew the family and put you onto this idea. But then I also know that your first book, didn't he also put you onto that too? So will you just talk a little bit about that, how that happened, who he is, and just sort of where the seed for this book came from through your conversations with him? And I just think it's great that he's so connected in some ways to all of yours, at least multiple stories.
Yeah, we could do the whole hour on John.
Yeah, we could just have a whole thing of talking about John Gluck.
I saw John's name in your acknowledgments and I said, well, now I know what to ask her. I don't know. You come up in journalism or in magazines, and everybody says you should have a mentor or someone to guide you. And you say, for me, you say to yourself, I don't have a stinking mentor. What do I do? And then lo and behold, somebody becomes your mentor. John edited me at New York Magazine for 10 years, by the end, we really understood each other very well, and we're really good friends. And we remained friends after he left and after I left. He edited the story that became the Lost Girls book. And then somewhere along the way, toward the end, he looked at a version of it too and offered comments. But what he understood about the sort of thing I do is that I tend to write about ordinary people who are caught up in something extraordinary, people who are vulnerable, people who are in crisis. And that's slightly different from what some of our colleagues at New York Magazine would do, writing about a mayor or a movie star or a fashion designer. Or writing an ideas story. I was really all about narrative and all about people, and then did whatever research I needed to do to get up to speed on the context and get at the deeper issues. So he knew that about me, and he also knew the Galvin family. He had gone to high school with Lindsay, the youngest of the 12 children, and became friends with Margaret as well over the years too. He knew that Margaret, for many years, had sort of held as a promise she was making to herself that this story would be told some way. Margaret had been keeping journals and diaries and really wanted the world to know about her family. He also knew Lindsay over the years as well and stayed friends with her. And he introduced me to the two of them just about 5 years ago. And I sort of got it all at once from them. They had been sort of saving it up for years. And in an hour and a half phone call, I learned about schizophrenia, and I learned about a murder-suicide, and I learned about sexual abuse and clergy abuse, and on and on and on. And I could not believe it all was happening to just one family. And when I eventually went back to John, just to bring it back to John and talk with him about it, I said, is this a story about two sisters who had a difficult childhood? Is it a case study science story about schizophrenia? Should I profile one of the researchers and make it a magazine story? There's no way that I could control a book that would have so many different people and so many different voices. People wouldn't be able to. I just written a book with 12 characters in it. Do I really want to do another book with 12 people in it? And all these questions. And he just sort of said, why not do it all? It's a good story. It's really good. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll do it all. So he helped me down the road in that way and helped me think big. And I think that's what any good editor can do, is sort of tell you make it good. And then it sort of clicks in your head. Oh yeah, okay, I'll make it good and not bad.
Right. Make it good, but also don't be afraid of all of it. Just go all the
Right.
places, do all the things, and then you'll figure it out. Right.
Right.
And it's interesting. I mean, it says a lot about his trust in you as a reporter. I mean, if he knew about this story for so long, I mean, John Gluck knows a lot of writers, and he has worked with a lot of writers who are, and I think it's interesting that he waited so long in some ways, right? He was an editor for a very long time. Like, he just had this story somewhere in the back of his head before he decided to come to you at a certain point and say, okay, now you,
I
right?
think it's because the sisters were ready,
Uh,
and they were ready in a kind of profound way, because their mother, Mimi, who died while I was working on the book, she was around 90 and not in good health. So there was a now or never feeling. I think if you ask the sisters, they could each have their own individual reasons why they were ready now, but there was momentum that I didn't recognize at first. I went very slow because I didn't want to push anybody into it, because it's a very vulnerable position to be talking about your family issues in this way. And I certainly didn't want to be the one driving the bus in the beginning. So it really was a year from the time that I first spoke to them that I sold the book and got working on it full time. I took it very slowly.
Interesting. It's funny, it was a
And that's
year.
nothing compared to 10 years writing about Henrietta Lacks's family, but
Well,
it was a year.
I mean, yeah, but it was a year of, I mean, it took me a year of that sort of from the first call. It's funny because we both had those moments where there was this phone call that was like, and I'm curious about that phone call for you. I went into that first phone call with, when I finally talked to Deborah Lacks for the first time, having a very vague sense of the story. There was this woman, I wanted to tell her story. I knew about the cells. I had no idea what the family had been through. And then there was this blah on the phone for an hour and a half with similars, like, there's murders, there's this, there's that. And I just sat there going, and while I was reading your book, I had that sense of, it's funny, I have a friend who always says that the highest compliment that one writer can pay another is jealousy. And I had that feeling of, I was reading this just going, I was jealous of the excitement of the amazingness of this story for you, which is, in a positive way. I was happy for you. And imagining that first phone call, and when you're just starting to realize how many pieces there are, and your brain, I was sort of imagining you on that call just going, oh my God. Yeah, so I'm curious what you knew going in, and then what was a shock, and sort of how that all revealed itself and changed the story in your head as you started understanding it.
I think I probably share something with a lot of writers, in that it's hard for me to get started on things, to have the confidence, because you feel like there's so much I don't know, and then there are all the things I don't even know that I don't know, and something's going to bite me somewhere along the way and really, really trip me up. I'm afraid. And that's how I felt with Lost Girls. In fact, John Gluck had to ask me several times to go and report on the Long Island serial killer case before I finally said, all right, I'll do it. Because I was like, there are cops reporters who have sources in the police department. They know more than me. Why would I go and do that? And then, of course, you get a head of steam, and then suddenly you turn a corner and nothing stops you. And at the beginning with the Galvin family, the thing that was stopping me was consent issues. I am not a prosecutorial interviewer. I'm not out to squeeze answers out of anybody. I want to write intimately and sensitively and dramatically and vividly about people's thoughts and feelings. I'm not necessarily their advocate. I don't cross the line into advocacy journalism, but I am also not a gotcha journalist. So I was ready for that call from one or more family members saying, there are medical privacy laws. We don't want to divulge our information. We don't want this made known. And so I needed to be confident that they were all willing. And what I didn't realize is that it wasn't just that Mimi was older and it was time to do it. It also was that everyone else in the family was deferring to the two sisters, who had experienced probably most of the hardships of being a child in the Galvin family. So for them to stand up and say, we want this, everybody else wasn't, they were going to respect their wishes.
Yeah, interesting. And that thing of being afraid, it's interesting. Susan Orlean, who is sort of in the world of the kind of writing that you and I do. I mean, she is one of the sort of heroes. Yeah, exactly. She has a phrase that I heard her say like a decade or so ago that really stuck with me, which was that when she's starting off on a project, she always tells herself she has to lean towards discomfort. That when there is something that feels scary or hard or something, that you have to actually lean into that, which it sort of is in line with what you were just saying. Like, you're anxious in the beginning. You're like, there's so much that I don't know. And is this right? And I was thinking about this idea of leaning into discomfort. It's funny, I wasn't thinking of it in those terms as I was reading, but I was thinking about this a lot in so many different realms. And one of those is like, you came to this, I mean, if you had a beat before this, it was sort of New York, it was crime, it was not science and ethics and mental illness. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of your stuff is about people who have suffered, and maybe people who would be discounted in society, prostitutes or, the mentally ill. But I'm curious about where that science piece fit in. Was that an additional level of nervousness for you? You were sort of tackling this whole new world, or did you have an interest in science? Like, was this something you wanted, or did you kind of go, oh God, science?
I was equally intimidated by the science,
Yeah.
but I was excited because it was something new. And I've learned a couple things over the years in my time doing weekly magazine journalism. The first is that I don't have a very good track record of predicting what's going to work out well and what isn't going to work out well, what I'm going to like and be proud of, and what I'm going to wish I never did. And often the thing to get thrown into something new and learn something new is extremely exciting and rewarding. And I look back and go, boy, I'm glad I did that. So at Business Week, I wrote a big story about CRISPR, about genetic editing. I'm not a science journalist, but I pushed really hard and learned something, and was very happy with that story. And so that sort of thing was fun for me. It has always been fun for me. And what I told myself at the beginning of working on Hidden Valley Road was that I had a certain amount of experience and expertise interviewing people about difficult moments in their lives, that was believe it or not, a comfortable area for me. And that the uncomfortable piece of it was going to be the science. And so it was a mix of old and new. So I could feel like I was growing and developing, and that I had a little bit of solid ground as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also in terms of that area that you were familiar with, talking to people about really hard, very personal things, talking to people who are sort of fragile about the experiences that you're talking to them. And it's a very specific kind of work. And in terms of one of the other ways I kept thinking about this discomfort was, so I was thinking, as I was reading, you were taking in so much painful information. And I think about this a lot with nonfiction writing, that so much of our job when we write about hard things is just take it all in, absorb it, and you have to sort of really feel it and experience it in some ways in order to bring it to life for people. But you also have to filter it, because people can't take the barrage of information that you experienced for the years you were working on the book. And so as I was reading it, especially, you interviewed a lot of the boys who, some of them at least who were schizophrenic. You went through medical records of just, incredibly difficult information. And I guess I just want to hear you talk about that process, like how you take all that in, how you absorb it, how you filter it, and also kind of stay grounded and keep going through that with people, either on paper or in person. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a general sense, like the short answer would be is that I'm often just as interested in the reaction to a bad event as the details of the event itself. So a lot of my conversations, starting with Margaret and with Lindsay, and then with all of the members of the family, was about how they processed the difficult moments, how they thought about them over time, how they changed their mind about them over the years. And so it's a little like not looking at the car crash, but looking at the emergency workers rushing to the scene. And at first I thought, well, maybe that's a bad thing. But then I thought, well, what if that's a feature and not a bug? Maybe what if that is the purpose of all storytelling in a weird way, to help us from Grimm's fairy tales on up, to help us process trauma. And in this particular story, the Galvin family story, is about how various members of a family separately and together process trauma. And they each have very different stories to tell in that regard. So it's a group portrait, but with very separate perspectives. Margaret's take on this is very different from Lindsay's, which is very different from Michael's, and so on, Mark's and John's and so forth.
Yeah, and and the story itself, on the surface, it's a very sad story. It's a story of a mother who, there are many points where it's like, oh, this is sort of the saga of the sad story of Mimi and the experience of having all these children, and then dealing with so much mental illness, and then there's the daughters. There's so many things, but in the end, and I've heard you say this in interviews, it's a very hopeful story to you, and I'm curious to hear just some specifics of that, like how. Yeah, sort of what it is that you think this is, the ways that this is a hopeful story, and sort of finding the light in all that darkness.
It's a look at how different people process trauma. It's a look at the very wobbly but nonetheless fascinating trajectory of scientific progress. A kind of a clear-eyed view of how everything is in a straight line, how there are all sorts of reversals and groupthink and bad theories that rule roost for too long, but generally, inevitably, things end up moving forward. So there's hope there. Specifically with this family, there were some scientific breakthroughs accomplished by two different teams of researchers who had started their work by looking at the Galvin family, and those breakthroughs happened just a year or so before I first met the family. So I felt from the very beginning that I had a way to end the book without overselling the book, because this book is not the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. There is no miraculous Rosetta Stone of information in the Galvin family's genes that solves the problem. It more is a fascinating test case for people to take out all the different theories and thoughts they've had about schizophrenia over decades and find a way to sort of funnel it through this family. So I didn't want to oversell it. But still, I felt like there was enough progress to make it satisfying. I guess the other way of answering this is I had just come off a book which had like the world's saddest ending, like a murder case that remains unsolved and lives that are ruined, and a police force that's totally compromised. And the moral of that book is real life isn't like CSI, and chaos and sadness often win. And so compared to that, this book is most certainly an upbeat book. But I had this conversation while I was writing it. People would say, "What are you working on?" And I'd explain it, and then I'd see their faces fall, and I'd say, "No, there's hope here. I know there's hope here." And I went looking for it. And also, I'm inspired, frankly, by everyone in the family.
Yeah,
Margaret and Lindsay and their kids and their husbands, like and of course what we haven't talked about yet, and perhaps we'll get to at some point, is the 6 sons who are still alive. There are 3 of them. I was quite concerned in the very beginning about making sure that I would write about them in a real way, that they wouldn't be monsters, and they also wouldn't be like precious mystics who had special sight that none of us see. I felt like our treatment of the mentally ill in fiction and in nonfiction sometimes is very othering. And I felt like the challenge would be to write about them as people, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do that. And then I met them and I saw that was actually going to be quite doable. I mean, they're all their own people. They all have their own personalities. They're really, and they're charming. They're fun to be around and interesting to write about. So that was an early relief to me as well.
Right. It's funny. I was going to ask if you had certain preconceived notions or ideas about mental illness, especially schizophrenia, that you found yourself being challenged, having challenged by them, specifically sitting down and talking to them, and like how your experience with them changed you and what you learned from them as people.
Yeah, I had very little technical information about schizophrenia. And all I could see as I sort of did dress rehearsals in my head about how to tell the story was almost like a bad horror movie where one by one, like the body snatchers, they go, and then he got sick too, and that's the last you ever hear about that person. And I was worried that I wouldn't be able to do anything beyond that. But what I learned from talking to each of them and from researching the records of the others was that schizophrenia is not a cookie cutter condition. Not only that, it isn't an illness, it's a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms that we've given the name schizophrenia. So that means some people might be delusional and others might have actual hallucinations, and others might have audio hallucinations. Their symptoms don't define them. The disease doesn't quite define them because it's different for everybody, even if you're in the same family. And that part was eye-opening to me. The other big surprise was that the medications are basically the same medications they've been prescribing for decades, for 40 or 50 years. And in our lifetimes, we've seen anxiety and depression and bipolar disorder all have miraculous breakthroughs with medication and great advancements. And I just assumed that every mental illness was a brain chemistry issue that we had really made progress on, but we really haven't made progress with schizophrenia. And that was a real eye opener to me.
Yeah, it was interesting. This is one of these books that it's about so many different things. So you can read it through so many lenses. It's the story of motherhood and a mother, and how the experiences of a mother, kind of shape the children, and also how that can be weaponized, right? Like the idea of a mother as maybe it's her fault. And, so there's that story, there's the story of each of the children, and there's also the story of the science and the sort of evolution of schizophrenia research. And no, it's hilarious. I just totally lost my train of thought. And I was like, and then, no, wait, there was another point that I was getting to, that what it was really, oh yeah. And one of the things I was struck with was that in some ways there's this subtle storyline that it's also about just mental health in general and like therapy. What can therapy do for people and what can it not do? And I thought that was a really interesting undercurrent, was how therapy helped the children in all these different ways, but yet still there were some that it didn't. So yeah, I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk about that, sort of, if that was a surprise to you, if, I don't know, how you saw therapy playing a role in all this.
There's really something for everyone. If you're looking for therapy tips in the book, there's one family member, Lindsay, who has a very traditional therapy experience that is like a slow drip over time, really helping her with the tools to make it through. And then Margaret's experiences are more adventurous and more eclectic, and she treasures those experiences and really feels like they've taken her through as well. And since the book has come out, each of them actually have been of help to others who have come to them, as I understand it. And so, and it's a Rorschach test. I gave an early draft to my brother, and he read about brain spotting, which is a technique that Margaret did, and his reaction was, cool, I want to try that, and then somebody else would find something else. But I think more broadly, with a book like this, with difficulties happening to people and them trying to find their way out of it, readers, I think, might find themselves searching for tips on, well, here's a family where terrible things happened. How did they make it through? Because we don't like to admit it, but all of us are going to have intense difficulties in our lives, and we secretly wonder if we can make it through.
Right,
So,
it's that hope you were talking about. There is something beautiful about seeing them go through all of these incredible things, sticking together for the most part, and also the ways that they find help, and it normalizes that to some degree. It's like, just therapy is therapy, whether you're part of a family that had such a catastrophic kind of story, or whether you're just, you're kind of, your version of trauma seems less than that, right? It's just like, I felt like that was a really great lesson in that, was to see how that was helpful to so many people.
They also end up, they aren't just dealing with their childhood traumas, they're also reevaluating their childhood belief systems that were sort of created for them. There was sort of an understanding, I think, among some of the siblings growing up, that mom was a disciplinarian and that she was making some bad decisions, perhaps putting them in harm's way, and that dad was this kind of flawless, titanic intellectual figure who could do no wrong. But then in part 2 of the book, the script flips, and various family members start to see Mimi with new eyes, see the mother with as a more multidimensional personality, which I intentionally did. I think in fiction and nonfiction together, that mothers really take it on the chin, and that it's too easy an answer, and that this mother is way too complicated to just write off as the villain, and she certainly isn't. And then of course the father has his own complications as well. And these are things that are sorted out in a therapeutic setting as well.
Yeah, and in some ways, this is part of the way this is a story of everybody, right? This is a story of, oh, as you get older, you start to realize, oh, what I thought about my parents is like, I now understand them in a way I didn't understand them, and how important it is to do that, to sort of understand your parents' stories. And yeah, one of the things that I loved in the book, and one of my big kind of moments of like, oh, I would have loved to have heard your reaction when you learned this detail, was the falconry piece. When early on in the book, you start writing about, you mentioned Mimi, the mother, having this falcon and sewing its eyes closed and beginning to train it and domesticate it. And I was like, wow, where are we going with falconry? Interesting. But then it's just an unbelievable story and metaphor. So can you just talk about that a little bit, and how the role that played in your head? It seemed like it was there was some sort of organizing principle there. It felt like it was really speaking to you.
This was a subject the family was excited about. It was something that made them, the family hobby of falconry that their parents had and that the older siblings had. And they liked to talk about it. It wasn't something that I, yanked out of them. For those on the Zoom who haven't read the book, it is what makes this family historically distinctive. That it was the Galvin, Mr. and Mrs. Galvin, Donald and Mimi, who first suggested to the Air Force that they make the official mascot the falcon. And I went to the Air Force archives. I looked at all the files on the mascot and how it came about, and I saw all these letters, the original letters from other people suggesting other things as mascots. And sure enough, theirs was the first suggestion for the falcon. They were the first. So they carried that around like a badge of honor, and they really thought it was interesting. And so early on, when I wanted to procrastinate and not learn more about schizophrenia and not ask nosy, tragic questions to people about their childhoods, I decided that I would make falconry a major metaphor in the book. But then, of course, in rewrites, it got dialed back tremendously because I became more confident about the other material. But as a metaphor, it is as obvious and useful as it gets. You have a hobby that they didn't take up golf. They took up an extraordinarily difficult pastime that tied them to generations of royalty and of elite classes that made them feel special. And it took a tremendous amount of work and sweat and discipline to do it. And afterwards, they could feel accomplished. And they came away, and this is the 1950s, remember when the time of optimism, they came away thinking that if you worked hard and paid attention to detail and did everything right, then sooner or later, good things were going to happen to you. And this was their viewpoint. And this was a viewpoint they shared with many people in their generation. And this is a story of a family where things do not go well, quite often outside of their control. And so to me, it feels like, and I've said this in interviews before, it feels like American Pastoral by Philip Roth. It feels like, what happens when the family that does everything right has a cataclysm happen to them. Right. So I had that in mind early on, for sure.
Interesting. And yeah, and just the metaphor of like, falconry is all about trying to take this incredibly wild animal who's this predator and tame it and make it, yours, and sort of take that nature out of it in some ways, or use it to your advantage. And so that, I just thought you artfully did that throughout, of just kind of the falconry would appear, but it wasn't like being hit over the head with this metaphor of, look, this family is controlling falcons, and yet this whole thing is happening with their children that they can't control.
Yeah, eventually I took my foot off the gas there because I didn't want it to be like a creative writing exercise. The falcons would come back over and over again. Then suddenly they looked up and saw a falcon. I didn't want that. Right. But certainly, yeah, it helps you understand. It's a good little key to understanding the family ethos.
Yeah. Sure. And I just have to say, when you said that the thing that made their sort of claim to fame was the falcon thing, but this was one of those things that I kept just going, wow, all these amazing details. It's like Lucille Ball shows up at one point, and Howard Hughes and the Rockefellers. And like, there's it seemed like whatever historic moment in person I was not surprised at a certain point in the book to be like, well, of course, Lucille Ball's here. Like that's the kind of story it is. Which was pretty amazing. but also just so much information. So I guess I would love to hear you talk a bit about just how you organized it all, how you found it all. You had, from my reckoning, you had a lot of medical records, a lot of interview transcripts from interviews you didn't do, and then interviews you did do. And then you have, I assume a lot of scientific journal articles. Can you just, I find that it's often hard for people to imagine the amount of stuff narrative nonfiction writers accumulate. So can you just kind of give us a sense of that and like walk through what your stuff was and how you organized it?
Sure. In the beginning, it felt like researching two books, the science book and the family book. And so I had two separate timelines really that I was building out, chronologies that would help me understand what happened before this and what happened before that. And the biggest thing with the family were long interviews with everybody who was available and was willing to be interviewed, starting with Mimi, and of course the two daughters, the two sisters, and then everybody else. And then there was a whole matter of trying to nail down the chronology from those interviews, because if something crazy happened, forgive the word crazy, sorry, if something strange happens on Thanksgiving one year, one person thinks it might be 1971, another person thinks it might be 1975. Like nobody really, I certainly don't remember one Thanksgiving to another. So there's a lot of that going back and cross-referencing and learning things. There were lots of medical records. With Lindsay's help, I was able to go through for some of the brothers, but not for others. There is a lot on Donald and a lot on Peter and a lot on Matthew. There is almost nothing on Jim. Would have been great to have more on Jim. So you end up, you take the wins when they come and put them together. There are also at least 20 far-flung family members who knew the family well, but aren't necessarily quoted in the book, who I talked to, including Mimi, the mother's sister, Betty, also around 90 years old, who I talked to and learned a lot from. And so you get everyone's, and then of course neighbors, maybe 20 neighbors, and then different people in different parts of their life who all could, if there's a time where one son goes off to Sacramento to become a rock musician, it was time to go and try and find people in Sacramento who remembered him. So there were like little side missions and that took place, almost like developing sidebars for each of the little prongs of the story. And then the science part was like reading 100 books, reading 500 PDFs of research papers, assembling a story, because that's the only, I tried listening to a neurobiology class, one of the free ones that like MIT has, and I thought this can't happen. I can't do this. I have to look at it as a story. And so I dialed into the whole idea of a debate over the causes of schizophrenia, a nature versus nurture debate that sort of meanders its way through the generations, and I held on to that as sort of a story to tell. Yeah. But then the real issue is what to leave out, because as reporters, we fall in love with our research. We find this beautiful thing that we want to show the world. And I was really, really afraid of, and maybe I did it, or I just don't know. I was afraid of starting a chapter that would say, here's another interesting thing I learned about schizophrenia. Did you know that in 1879, I did not want that to happen. I didn't want people to suddenly say, oh my God, I have to eat my vegetables now. I wanted it to feel seamless. And so I came up with rules with the help of Chris Popolo, my editor in Revision. I said, I'm only going to write about science stuff happening if it raises the stakes for the Galvin family, if it gives us context for what the Galvin family is going through, which means that there are some subjects with regard to schizophrenia and with acute mental illness that aren't in the book, or maybe they get a little passing mention, like R.D. Laing or some people who could have whole books written about them. They kind of wing by really fast.
Yeah, which is so, I kept, as a reader, I tend to go through and be like, where are the books he kind of was like, oh, I could do a whole book on that. I got like, and I could see, there's just so many in there. And they are, and I mean, I think you did a wonderful job of weaving the family story and the science story. And, I was thinking about this with your first book. This is a story about some people who had some very tragic, awful things happen to them. And it's also a story of an unsolved crime. And there's this sort of criminal justice angle to it of trying to sort of follow that story. And it's actually a very similar book in some ways, right? It's like, as you pointed out earlier, it's like, really, I'm doing another book with 12 people in it? Like, there's so many people, and there are these kind of parallel journeys. There's the family journey, and then there's the, in the first one, it's this, there's a crime. And in this one, it's the science. did it strike you that you were writing in a sense, the same book as you were going through? Were you like, oh, I recognize this. I'm kind of weaving these two similarly paced stories with a similar number of people. And, or did this one feel harder, easier? Like, yeah, how did that?
In one sense, I did know that I was doing something similar in that, in the sense that my habit, my training is to tell a tangled tale, a narrative story that's about one thing, and then at least one, maybe more than one, interesting and profound things happening below the surface, questions that the narrative raises. So a crime story about a guy who's accused of a gay hate crime, who stands up in the middle of the trial and says, it can't be a hate crime because I'm gay too. That's a tangled tale. But the thing going below it is, what is the hate crime law and why did we come up with it? And is it really appropriate? Are there people who are against it? Is it something we need or not? Like a whole jurisprudence question. So Lost Girls is about an unsolved murder. It's a whodunit without a who, but it also is about injustices that were done to this family and the ways that the women were made vulnerable and the structural issues in our society. And this is a story. This is a family story, a family saga, a multi-generational family saga about real people going through difficult things. But it's also about scientific progress and the price, the sacrifices that people like the Galvins make to perhaps create hope for future generations.
Absolutely. I mean, as I was reading, it's such a story of science and the importance of people being able to trust scientists and work with them. I think people often don't imagine how much of science is actually, the general public in some way or another, are patients working with scientists, but also how, it just doesn't often hold up and the science goes down these dead ends. And it's, that's sort of the progress of science. It's sort of this was a really beautiful illustration of the narrative of how that happens. And for me, obviously with, my interests with, tissue research and cells taken and used in research, I was really struck by how it's also a story in a very kind of, subtle way about the importance of getting consent for tissue collection when you do it and being able to keep track of the people and the samples, right? There is this sort of undercurrent to the story of like, where did the samples go? Who has them? Who owns them? And then you just see over and over again how being able to have those decades down the road has really led to important things for this family and for science. So I thought that was a beautiful kind of important storyline in there.
Yes, the trail of genetic material and who controls it and who has the money to do something with it. Those are all questions that inform the progress of science and also have very real consequences for how this family gets studied. I was very cautious. I didn't want to oversell that as a storyline because I didn't want to give readers the expectation that the genes had something magic in them that was going to solve the problem at the end. But yes, it's important. I think where our books do overlap is the question of sacrifice, of what the people are giving up in order to help other people. And the question that kind of lingers at some point that different people ask themselves, was it worth it? Was it worth it for Deborah to never have a mother? Right. But yet to know that so many people might be helped by the loss of her mother. How torturous to experience that. And for many of these Galvin kids who are now grown up, is it helpful to them, or to some of them, to know that their family's significance might actually bring about progress, despite the fact that so much difficulty happened in their lives? Or is it something that they could take or leave? They each have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. I mean, along those lines, it's all of medical progress in some way or another was done at the cost of a lot of somebody's families, animals, there are so many beings that get us to where we are in medicine and keep medicine going. And the public, people don't tend to know that. So I think in some ways that's the similarity here is just like, it's important to know the stories that you've benefited from, maybe you don't have schizophrenia in your family, but there's a lot of research that then can kind of branch out from the research done with this family that touches maybe your life and so I think, yeah, I was I saw it as one of those stories as well, of just like, right, this is the cost of science often, and it's usually a hidden cost. And so yeah, I'm curious about the family's response, right? And also their relationship with the book. Did any of them read it before it came out? Did you have discussions about it, in the sort of, whether it was fact checking wise, but also just what might happen after it came out? Did they have, desires and, with the book, sort of what their response to that was, and then how they've felt since seeing the response?
I'll just to go through it quickly, I'll just generalize and say that early on, everyone was really courteous and always picked up the phone, and everybody was ready to talk to me. And I would go out to Colorado. I went out 8 times and spent evenings hanging out with different people and talking for hours on end. And it was all really seamless. Nobody said, you know what, I don't feel like answering that question at any point. It was really quite, everybody felt like they were doing something helpful. And then they were interested in what would bubble up from this story that would weave together everybody's points of view. And then a few months before the book came out, they each started to get nervous because it became more real. It's sitting there on Amazon. There's 2 paragraphs explaining what the book is. Their family pictures on the cover. People magazine wants to profile them before the book comes out. And from each of them, I start to get questions like, what the hell is this thing? Like, is this going to be like a car crash of a book that people gawk at? Is it going to be exploitative? Is it voyeuristic? Am I going to regret this? And in reading early versions, the opinions were all over the place. They were reading a group portrait. They weren't really reading portraits of themselves. They were reading portraits of the family. So for some of them, there was news in it. And for others, there were perspectives that were being provided by one sibling and not another sibling. And then there were errors that were corrected along the way. The Colorado errors that perhaps many people in the Zoom, if they've read early printings of the book, trust me, most likely it's been corrected by now. But email me if you see something. And but then the most amazing thing happened, and her name is Oprah Winfrey, and the book became got really well reviewed, and it got, more importantly, it got viewed the way that I had always hoped and that the family had hoped it would be viewed, which is as something that was generous in spirit and not meant to be voyeuristic and not meant to be exploitative. And so a lot of people were very relieved. That said, that I think it really helped people move on to new chapters in their lives. I'll just give a couple examples I don't want to speak too much for them now that the book's out, but Lindsay, who does a lot of the caregiving for the sick brothers, she also now is on the boards of 2 different organizations and is really amping up her mental health advocacy, not just serving in organizations, but also helping one-on-one families who have vulnerable people in their lives. She's very interested in the issue of anosognosia, of helping people who don't know that they're mentally ill, don't know that they're delusional. They think there's nothing wrong with them. She has a lot of experience, the whole family does, with their many brothers had this, and so she wants to help people with that. Margaret, again, without speaking too much for her, believes, as you can see toward the end of the book, that she's slightly, it's taken her a long time to speak for herself and to find her own voice and to create the right amount of distance from her family so that she can really do things with her life that she's always wanted to do. And her artwork has exploded, gotten lots of attention. And she told me in her last email that she's very, very happy with the new directions in her life. And I learned over the past course of the year that from her, that various people were coming to her for counsel and advice on how to reckon with family traumas. So this was what she wanted as well. This aspect of it has been productive for her, I'd like to think.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm seeing that we're at the Q&A portion of the evening, so I'll just read out some of the questions here. One of them was about, it says, from Hannah. It says, Lost Girls was adapted for film. Will Hidden Valley Road also become a movie? What has the experience been like to see your work adapted for the screen? this was on my potential questions too. It's always, it's such a strange experience to watch your stuff go from book to screen, because obviously they're very different mediums. You have this much space in a book and then a few hours in a movie. And so, yeah, I'm curious to hear about your experience with that. And also, yeah, this question of whether this one is going to be a movie also.
I think, there's so many streaming services now. There's such a demand for material, and the miniseries format is perfect for nonfiction stories that we all were sort of expecting that there might be interest, and there is interest. And this time around, I'm involved, hoping to, nothing's etched in stone, but I think it would be a miniseries. It would be dramatic. It would be scripted, and it would be the family story, similar to the book. But this time around, I felt like it made sense for me to be a part of it. With Lost Girls, I really had no clue how to adapt it. That was really an ensemble book with 5 different families and a murder case. It was a feature film and not a mini series. And I had no idea how to do it. And they came in with an approach that I really respected and really am very pleased with how it came out. But this time, for whatever reason, I'm ready to sort of sit there and go to meetings and see where it takes me. So I guess we'll see. If I sound tentative, it's because I feel like with these things, they're always about to happen, and then until they aren't, right? Like I imagine that one day, like in 2 months, there'll be crickets, right? Like there'll be no will return the call. Whereas, who knows? Maybe it won't, but we'll see.
Right. I mean, especially with Hollywood, because it all takes a long time. There's this so much flux.
My kids haven't stopped laughing at me because I've told them like 1,000 times that the Lost Girls movie wasn't going to happen, and then so they're very pleased.
One of the stories here was just about how, from Anonymous, is how significantly did your manuscript evolve from draft to publication? Was there one memorable change made by you or your editor that really made the final draft better?
I'm a big believer in the sloppy kitchen sink first draft. I sort of would make myself a promise that it was going to change considerably. So don't sweat it so much, just get something out there and look at it. And so then that means it's a very humbling moment when you actually read everything on the page for the first time, because then you're like, oh, this is, what have I done? This is terrible. And then you pick yourself up from the floor and you say, oh, well, this won't do. I'll have to move this here. And then you start to then you're really in it, and it starts to become exciting. So yes, there was significant revision. Off the top of my head, the biggest change was those science chapters were written in a very a much more intellectual pitch than they may still be now, but they really were they felt like they were in a different book. And my editor, Chris Popolo, she pointed out to me, she said maybe work the tone of those to make them more accessible, so it feels like they belong in the same book. And that's also when we made the decision to make sure to really almost like tying the sails down, really trimming them down so that there's nothing in those chapters that doesn't make you want to study for a test, but instead is really about the Galvin family and raises the stakes for the Galvin family. So a lot of the revision was based on that. And then there were other things, like there are some little surprises toward the end that weren't surprises in the early draft that I said in the beginning, and decided to hold them off. And then there was one thing that I gave away in the beginning that I decided not to save till the end. That part felt like looking at the rough cut of a movie and deciding, no, we have to learn this here and not there.
Yeah. And speaking of narratives and the two different ones and braiding them back and forth, I'm just curious about your process for that. This actually brings us, it's sort of appropriate, we're at the end here, and this brings us full circle to John Gluck. Because when I was working on my book, mine has 3 narratives that I was sort of braiding, and I was driving myself sort of slowly mad by trying to write it that way. I was jumping around back and forth between all the narratives thinking, oh yeah, you'll just kind of know when to go from this narrative, which, in your case, the family to the science and back to the family. And I had given John, because I had written for him at New York and we were friends, and I'd given him of the first section of the book to read and give me feedback on. And he said, I'm going to earn my sentence and your acknowledgements right now. saying, stop trying to do that. So just separate them out, write each of the narratives straight and chronologically, and then braid it, or you're just going to create a mess for yourself. And so that's what I did. I unbraided everything that I'd done and then wrote them in a sort of straight line, the three of them, and then moved everything around. But I'm curious to hear what your process was for that, and how you kind of did the braiding, how you mapped it all out and put it together.
I love the word braiding there. That's exactly what had to happen. What happened was I was so tied. I was so addicted to the idea of chronology, to making sure that because you discover so much with chronology, you realize things that other people hadn't said to you yet. Like, wait, Peter's first psychotic break happened 4 weeks after his father's stroke, and he was standing right there when his father had the stroke. Wow, how interesting that one happened right after the other. So I really wanted to stay in time. But then what happens is you write a chapter where you're writing about 17 things happening to 17 different people in 4 different states, all because they happened in 1972. And that's a lot of braiding. So the unbraiding happens. I'll change my answer. That's the biggest revision part, the unbraiding. Because what later on, after I handed in the manuscript, I had a month or 6 weeks to wait for the editor to come back. So I said, I'm going to read War and Peace, right? So it took me a year to read War and Peace, but I started it. And what I learned from War and Peace is that you could have a long chapter on what so-and-so is doing, and it could just be about so-and-so, and it was cool. Like you could rest easy as a reader, because you knew that he was going to come back to tell you what the other people were up to in the next chapter. He didn't need to braid, and he never braided. And so I was like, well, if he's not going to braid, I'm not going to braid.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. And one of the other questions was sort of about this, how you wove the narrative. And it said, I love the way you integrate the history of schizophrenia science, and the sections about the scientists are so wonderfully narrative. Was it difficult to get all of those details about them, a lot of which are personal?
Yeah. Dr. Lynn DeLisi, who's a really wonderful person and was really very happy to talk to me. One day I asked her what her maiden name was, because I had a paragraph about her growing up, and I was, just wanted to say, her name wasn't always DeLisi, it was Johnson or whatever it was. And she bristled and she said, I don't understand what I thought the book was about schizophrenia. Why do you need to know my maiden name? And I said, and I stepped back and I said, I certainly don't need to know it, whatever you're comfortable with, just sort of trying to tell your story. So yeah, there was a little bit of that stuff happening there, but I felt like her personal journey had great echoes with other things that were happening in the book. The way that women were treated by the psychiatric profession, mothers in particular, really dovetailed well with the way women in science and in research were being treated when she was coming up. And so I wanted that echo to be in the book for sure. At one point, I pulled out some of those science chapters entirely and said, what if this is just vanity, with me trying to show off about how much I know about schizophrenia? What if this was just a book about the family? And I started reading the chapters about the family one after the other without those breaks, and I couldn't breathe. I realized that you kind of need the break. You need to step away and think about what's happening.
Yeah. Oh, and it also gives the family's story this enormous context. Then you see, I often, when, we talked about this sort of jumping back and forth between the narratives. For me, there was this, the Lacks family, so much of what happened to them was bad at the hands of science. So much of what science did was good. And I wanted people to have that experience, like, yay, science, boo, science, yay, science, boo, science. To go back and forth between these stories, and your emotions do this, which is sort of, that's how science happens. And I think that was a similar, there was something similar that was happening in your story, which was like, oh God, the cost of this is so high. Oh, maybe it's going to lead to something good. And I felt like it was a real necessary juxtaposition, both for the breathing space, but also just to really understand the power of the story for the end of the family.
Yeah. And there were some decisions I had to make along the way, because everyone in research is in their own silo. If I had tapped somebody in this field on the shoulder before I met the Galvin family or knew about them and said, who are the biggest schizophrenia pioneers in your field? The two researchers who studied the Galvin family would not be the names that they would mention, most likely because there are at least, there are dozens of people all doing their thing. That's all very interesting. And so at some point I had to decide these people are important and their breakthroughs are important because their research began in talking about this family, and they are a way for readers to understand this condition. And they are promising. And that doesn't mean that others aren't. And then of course I fact checked and went back and interviewed other people, competitors to them, and they all acknowledged, yes, that they are important. So I wasn't making it up. But to make that editorial decision to focus on one thing and on another is really what's the nonfiction's all about.
Yeah, right. And were there any points, I mean, I know that you had the family sort of buy-in in some ways from the beginning. Were there points during the process where they got scared and sort of backed away and you had to navigate sort of winning and maintaining their trust through it? And how did you do that?
Yeah, there were occasional huddles, where when I would be in Colorado for a few days and somebody would say, hey, well, let's get together. And suddenly I'd be out for hours going on a walk with one person. And after a while, they would start asking me questions like, what is this? What are you really working on here? What is this really about? And so there was a lot of that. And the key for me was to be transparent. I mean, I said it earlier, I'm not an advocacy journalist. I felt like the book would have more power as a work of traditional journalism. I think one of the brilliance of your book is the way that you use first person to talk about just to tell the story of how damaged and recalcitrant the family was and how shy and how tricky it was for them to even emerge from seclusion. But I didn't need to do any of that. I didn't need to be in this book. And I didn't want to be in it. And so I needed to talk with them about what it was going to be and what it wasn't going to be.
Right. I'm seeing we're getting the last question flag here. And I mean, just to sort of, that thing you just said, the transparency piece in terms of trust. I mean, I've always felt like that in some ways is the most important piece, at least for these sorts of stories. And I often say that, I wasn't trained as a journalist. I was trained as a scientist, and I came to writing through a different path. And I think that was a benefit to me because I didn't know you weren't supposed to be transparent with them. Like a lot of journalists are like, no, I asked the questions here. And I'm wondering if for you, I know this is like the sort of end, I guess, but I know you didn't do a traditional journalism program. I mean, do you feel like sort of the way you came into journalism let you see sort of do that because that's not a standard journalistic practice to sort of be totally transparent all the time?
I've had many years talking to many different people in many different circumstances and following the very basic rules of journalism. And I found that what works best for me is not a situation where I'm double dealing or coming back and doing a gotcha project and then congratulating myself for how I got one over on them. I mean that the whole process is tricky enough, and people feel exploited enough without it being overtly like that. Right. Much better to say what you're going to do and then be able to say, listen, I'm going to be in this business for many, many decades after we talk. And so it doesn't behoove me to be dishonest with you. Right. And then also say to them, go back and talk to other people who have been interviewed by me, and they'll tell you whether or not I'm a straight shooter or not. And building all of that up was always very important to me. So that kind of kept me going from project to project. But it also that each story was very research heavy. I did very few like run around with a tape recorder and file the story kind of story. For whatever reason, probably because I was a generalist trying to fight to get into the magazine, I was doing stories that needed a little bit of research and a little bit of digging. Not always science, but often maybe criminal justice or the law. So I had that to lean on as well, beyond the interviewing with sources.
Right. Well, I'm glad you're going to be in the business for decades. I'm excited to read whatever the next thing is that you do. And yeah, thank you for telling this story.
Rebecca, it's
what-
a real honor to be in conversation with you like this. Thank you so much. And thanks to Aspen Words, to Adrian and Elizabeth and everybody involved. I'm just really grateful.
And Robert and Rebecca, thank you so much. This was such an extraordinary conversation. And thank you for your time and your contributions to literature and just being part of our community tonight. We really, really appreciate it. It was just wonderful. And thanks to all of you for joining us on Zoom. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that if you don't already own Hidden Valley Road, you'll buy it now. We also hope you'll be able to join us at our next event on March 16th, when we'll be taking a sumptuous journey into the world of food with a discussion of food memoir. And thanks again, stay well, and see you next time.